Hi, everyone. Welcome to Forum One's April 2015 webinar, Tune Up or Be Tuned Out, Optimizing Site Performance for User Engagement. Thank you very much for joining us. Today we'll be talking about the recent collaboration between Forum One and Mercy Corps to improve the performance of mercycorps.org. We hope you will leave today with some insights on site performance and how performance can be measured. I'm Heather Verga from Forum One, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. To prevent background noise, all phone lines are currently muted. If you're listening from your computer, select the mic and speakers option in your sidebar audio section. If you're experiencing audio problems, you may select the telephone option from the sidebar and the audio section, and follow the phone numbers. You'll have a phone number, access code, and then an audio pin to join the call via the phone. We'll have Q&A for our presenters at the end of today's webinar. If you have any questions, you may submit them via the questions section in the sidebar, tweet us at Forum1, or use hashtag F1Webinar. This webinar is being recorded. Look out for a webinar email with a link to the recording and the slide deck. Next slide, please. Forum One, next slide, is a digital agency that combines tech savvy, issue sophistication, design execution to help influential organizations craft solutions to the world's most pressing problems. Since 1996, we've been passionately committed to helping our clients extend their influence. Forum One focuses solely on working with organizations that are looking to make great changes in the world. We are 100% mission focused and work with some of the largest think tanks, NGOs, foundations, and government agencies in the world. Our full-service agency provides digital strategy, design, development, data, and ongoing support services. Today's webinar presenters are Drew Betts of Mercy Corps and John Brandenburg of Forum One. Drew Betts is a UX designer at Mercy Corps, bringing over 15 years' experience in web design, development, and marketing to this global aid agency. He's a big-picture guy who knows how to collaborate with various parts of an organization and its customers, and enjoys using both sides of his brain, switching between defining high-level business goals to writing HTML code and designing and testing user interfaces. John Brandenburg is a developer at Forum One, which means he recommends and implements technical solutions for our clients' websites and web applications. John has a bachelor's degree in psychology from Christopher Newport University and is actively pursuing a master's in information technology from Virginia Tech. And I'm Heather Verga. Next slide, please. I'm Heather Verga, manager of Forum One Support Services. I lead Forum One's dedicated support team in providing long-term strategic support, development, and fully managed web hosting services. Now I'd like to turn things over to our presenters. Take it away, Drew.
Okay, thanks, Heather. So as Heather mentioned, I am Drew Betts, UX designer with Mercy Corps. For those of you who don't know who Mercy Corps is, we're a global humanitarian aid organization. We were founded 36 years ago to provide relief and support for the refugees that were fleeing the war and famine of Cambodia. And since then, we've helped more than 170 million people in over 115 countries around the world survive emergencies and rebuild their communities. Next slide. So when emergencies strike, like the earthquake that just happened in Nepal, we respond immediately to meet the urgent needs for food, water, and shelter. And after the emergency, we partner with local communities to help them rebuild. And you can see pictured here is a young man participating in a Mercy Corps carpentry program in the Helmand province of Afghanistan. Next slide, please. So as a mission-based organization, our website is critical in engaging site visitors and raising funds for our efforts. And last year, actually last June, I was testing our site, and I was surprised at how slowly it loaded on my phone. So I started to begin to research site speed. And what we have on this slide is a screenshot from webpagetest.org. This was my first stop. It's a free service that allows you to test the speed of your site. Give it a URL, and then you can choose which browser and even what connection speed to test with. It runs a test, and it creates a report. So without getting too far into the technical details at this point, you can see that we had a load time of 4.8 seconds. but it also gives you letter grades for various site performance metrics, and you can see that we had a lot of room for improvement. If desktop was bad, mobile was much worse. Next slide, please. It took over 19 seconds for our homepage to load on an iPhone, and I could just picture users trying to come to our site and giving up in frustration. So aside from turning away visitors, it turns out there's a lot of evidence that slow speeds negatively impact other aspects of your site. So when we begin talking about site speed, what's often cited is a landmark presentation from Walmart in 2012. And the red line is conversion rate, and the blue bars there are load times. And they found that for every 1 second of improvement in load time, they experienced up to a 2% increase in conversions. And for every 100 milliseconds of improvement, incremental revenues grew by up to 1%. Increased load times also increased bounce rates and decreased revenues. So you can imagine from somebody at Walmart scale what improving these speeds had on their bottom line. Now, you might also be wondering how, or you might be wondering how Mercy Corps and Walmart are related. But you know, when we began to dig into this and look for research, we really couldn't find much research, or any research really, that had been done on the effects of site performance for fundraising activities. Well, it turns out that site speed has other negative effects. Slow site speed. It negatively impacts your SEO because a slow site means that the Google bot can only index a few of your pages. Google also uses site speed as part of its page ranking algorithm, and slow sites lower the perceived, there's evidence that slow sites lower the perceived quality of the brand. It frustrates users, I think something we can all relate to, and it increases the bailout rate. So now we've kind of talked about the negative effects of the site. I'll turn it over to John to talk about evaluating performance.
Thanks, Drew. So you know who Mercy Corps is, you know who Forum 1 are, and why we're interested in site speed so much. Let's talk about what site speed is anyway. When we talk about site speed, we use a few different ways to define it. The first is page load time. This measures how long it takes for a page to completely load with all referenced assets. This also includes elements that aren't perceptible to the user, like analytic scripts and third-party tools. So a page that appears to load in under 2 seconds may actually take 15 seconds or more. This can be okay, though, since it's all about the user experience. Next is what we call time to first byte. This is the time it takes that passes between when your browser makes a request for a page and the moment your browser begins receiving that page's data. This time includes domain name server lookup, so looking up where the page is, establishing a connection between your page, your browser, and the server, any sort of handshakes required for HTTPS or secure connections, and the time Drupal actually spends generating the page. Time to first byte is a pretty critical value, especially for the primary page that you're downloading, as it blocks downloading all other assets on the page, like images and styles and scripts. The third measure we talk about is start render. This refers to how long a request takes before a user actually begins to see content being displayed on a page. So it's actually a pretty complex subject, and there are a lot of different drivers of these values. Some we have more control of than others, hence I've crossed out a couple items on this list. I'm not going to go through each one of these, and this isn't a comprehensive list, but I will call out caching and downloading assets as areas where we have a lot of control over in a Drupal site. So you need a few important things out of the tools you use to measure performance. First, you need to analyze how your page is structured and how it behaves. You need to figure out how optimized your assets are, and you need something that can perform load testing, so simulating large amounts of traffic to your site. And here are the tools we used. Webpagetest.org, as Drew described earlier, is a free service. It has a REST API that we utilized, which provides a good analysis along with a waterfall diagram for your web pages loading. Google PageSpeed is a similar tool. It can provide separate analyses for mobile and desktop performance. And Apache Benchmark is a great tool for simulating heavy loads on a server, and already comes packaged with any Apache web server installation. We also utilized a paid service, New Relic, which provides a wealth of data from a live production site. We also use Google Analytics to measure content engagement, and we'll get into that in some more detail later. For the future, I would consider utilizing a tool called JMeter. This integrates a set of similar tools into a single application that organizes the results of test runs. Because in this project, we found that sifting through the mountain of data we collected became a challenge in and of itself. But regardless, in an effort to make these tests more consistent, I wrote a script to integrate them, which I've made available on my GitHub account. Also, the user engagement script we use for analytics is also available through this link, which we'll post online later. So we have our instruments. The next step was to come up with a consistent way to apply them, which Drew will walk us through.
So for us, when coming up with the process to do the testing, we wanted to simulate as closely as possible the experience of our users when they came to the site. So we had to follow a consistent process from choosing the test metrics that we wanted to run, then establishing baseline and goals, deciding on which changes to make and prioritizing them, developing and applying each change, measuring the effect, and then repeating the process all over again. So we had some other, felt very strongly that we should follow some other guidelines. So no virtual machines. The servers that we tested needed to be as close to production as possible. And this was, while we can mirror the servers, we weren't able to replicate the load balancing which takes place for mercycorps.org. Also, no virtual machines for the same reason as keeping the testing environments as similar as possible. A note to people out there who are going to do this yourselves to run Google PageSpeed and to run webpagetest.org. The test servers need to be publicly available. So as John alluded to, so page load speed was one of the critical metrics on it. Also conversion rate, and conversion rate is basically the number of visitors to the number, well, we're defining as the number of visitors to the number of donations that were made on our site. And then engagement rate. And engagement rate is, well, it's a new metric. Doing research into this, it's very difficult to measure how users are engaging with the content on your site. I'll get to that in the next slide. But response time in Apache, and this was a synthetic, essentially a synthetic test to, as John said, to simulate the load that the Apache could handle. So engagement rate. This tracks it's in Google Tag Manager and as part of Universal Analytics in Google Analytics, and it fires off specific events when the page is loaded. Then it tracks essentially the scrolling on the page, and it creates other events for when the visitor begins reading the page, when they make it to 25% through the page, 50%, 75%, and then 100%. And those numbers in red that you can see to the right are sort of some baseline metrics. Now, we have only had the script in place on our site for a short time, and so we're, I would say, still continuing to gather a baseline for it. We also included in there the bounce rate for the pages and the number of pages per visit. So the conversion rate, Mercy Corps, like other global aid organizations, traffic and donations fluctuate wildly during the course of the year. So what we've done is taken a baseline for all of 2014 and broken it out by mobile and desktop. So we've identified the test and metrics, and the next step was to come up with what to improve, and I'm going to hand it over to John to talk about that.
Thanks, Drew. We identified a number of items to improve on the site. But before that, though, I just wanted to give some really quick and easy tips to anybody who manages a Drupal website. If that is you, then take note, and right after this presentation, go confirm that these settings are enabled on your site. They come with no risk and are often looked over. First, enable page caching for anonymous users. Instead of regenerating a page every time for every user, you can save that page and reuse it. Occasionally, this might get tricky, as we'll get into in a moment, but for most setups, this should always be on. The next step is aggregating and compressing your CSS in JavaScript. This will take several large files, compress them, and smush them together. Since most browsers can only download between 5 and 8 things at one time, the fewer individual items a page requires, the better it performs overall. If you're not sure how to do this or are interested in what kind of impact this has, you can see my recent blog post on forum1.com. Back on track for mercycorps.org. For the first set of changes, we went through caching all around. These were picked because we believed that they would provide a significant impact compared to the level of effort required. We enabled the views cache because we believed that it would be an easy win, and it only required a simple configuration change to each view. The page cache is normally a simple option, as I just said, but we saw some unusual behavior around when users were being served cached pages, so we wanted to investigate this further. Memcache is a popular alternative caching mechanism that allows applications to store data in active memory instead of in a database on your file system, and it's fairly simple to set up. And this was just for the first round of improvements. So let's review what we went through to implement these improvements and see what impact they had. The first change we made was enabling views caches, which allows us to cache many of the individual elements that make up a page. This is a straightforward change to make. Although it required some testing, we learned that the open layers-based views, which drive a lot of the maps on the site, couldn't be cached without running into an issue of cross-cache contamination. So, for example, if you went to an Afghanistan page, you would see a map of Afghanistan. If you went to the Nigeria page afterwards, you would still see a map of Afghanistan. We also added the views content cache module to the site. This is a module that will expire any cached view when related content is updated. So let's say I have a list of articles. This list will only be refreshed when I add a new article or update an existing one. The result of the views caching showed a modest improvement, which was what we expected. Just a quick explanation of the charts you're looking at. These show us the percentage of requests served under each time. So, for example, 20% of requests were served in 3.5 seconds or less. 80% of requests were served in 3.8 seconds or less, and so on. The chart on the left shows the site being hit with 10 requests simultaneously, and the one on the right shows the site being hit with 50 requests simultaneously, both across 1,000 requests. In the benchmark tests, the 10 concurrent requests we showed about a 15% improvement. Mean response time to first byte, went from 3.7 to 3.2 seconds. This trend continued into 50 users in load testing, although with a much greater overall response time. Admittedly, to properly test this change, the page cache needed to be off entirely, so normal anonymous traffic spikes wouldn't typically experience such slow response times. Because we're seeing inconsistencies in the page cache, that needed to be addressed next. I previously mentioned that the page cache is typically a simple thing to do that greatly improves the performance of any Drupal site. However, in the case of mercycorps.org, cached pages were being served in an erratic way, so we had to dig into the code. What we found was that something called the session variable was being used. This triggered Drupal to create sessions for anonymous users, but only when they visited a previously uncached page. This is the same mechanism that allows you to log into a site. These sessions then prevented those users from being served any cached pages until their session expired, which is about 2 days by default. We quickly found alternative means of handling session data and implemented that. We also recommended that Mercy Corps extend their page cache expiration time from 5 minutes to an hour. I'm also going to jump into the next measure we implemented, which was setting up the memcache module. This is an alternative caching mechanism that is much faster than the default database cache. In one module that complements memcache well is entity cache. This module, as you could have guessed, caches entities, which helps improve performance in many areas across a Drupal site. In simulated load testing, mean time to first byte went from 4.5 seconds to 1.5 seconds on the donation page. This was at 50 users. As a follow-up to the web page test Drew mentioned, load time dropped from 2.3 seconds, about a 50% drop. Time to first byte dropped to about 0.34 seconds, which is about 65%. For many reasons, which I wish I could provide you with more details about how these changes perform under typical load in production, but we are in an atypical time for the Mercy Corps team. So our live monitoring data is skewed by increased traffic to the site. All these measures were ready just in time for a serious event that's unfolding right now, which is the aftermath of the 7.8 magnitude earthquake that struck Nepal. Mercy Corps has one of the largest humanitarian teams in the country and is in a unique position to respond to the aid for the people in the region. So these measures were nearly ready to go when this tragedy happened. Over the course of this past weekend, the Forum 1 and Mercy Corps teams tested these changes and pushed them directly to production. When disasters like these gain international media attention, people desiring to help pour in to donate to organizations like Mercy Corps through their public site. So these platforms need to be ready to handle this traffic. Anecdotally, the Mercy Corps team recently commented that they used to sweat when 400 visitors were visiting the site at a time. Now they welcome them with open arms. We also wanted to mention an interesting coincidence. Over a month ago, we randomly picked a country page on mercycorps.org to run our benchmark tests on. That country was Nepal. So I'm going to pass this over to Drew to talk about content engagement and conversion rates.
So thanks, John. So as John said, this is an atypical time for Mercy Corps, and so we are still trying to we need a little bit more data essentially to come up with the impact on conversion rates because of the impact of Nepal. I think that the important thing here is, as from the previous slide, is that we've been able to scale up. The work that we've been able to push out to mercycorps.org has allowed us to scale up, and that translates to basically more aid raised to help the people of Nepal, and that is that's what's most important here. I'm looking forward to seeing the impact of the changes and actually coming up with some metrics once things have shaken out a little bit. And I'll pass it back to John here for the next round of changes are in the pipeline.
So yeah, we're not done with this project yet. We have a few more items we want to implement on mercycorps.org, such as deferring the JavaScript so it's included at a different time to allow other assets on the page to be downloaded first. We would like to set them up with Varnish, which is a reverse proxy cache. Essentially, it's a caching layer that sits in front of Drupal, and it's lightning fast. And we'd also like to work more on the mobile version of the site, since we still can make some improvement here. A few lessons learned during the course of this project. One, for me, was to watch your headers. Because of the inconsistent caching that we saw on mercycorps.org, we initially thought that the cache was working normally because we were initially being served cache pages. But if you continued following the route through the site, you would notice that you would stop getting served these cache pages. And performance testing is actually pretty hard. You can run into a lot of erratic results in your data, so staying consistent with your benchmark testing is quite a challenge, actually. So with that, thank everybody for listening on this webinar, and we'll open the floor to questions, which Heather has been collecting through Twitter and in the chat, and she'll pose them here.
Great, thank you. So I just want to remind everyone that we're accepting questions via the chat on the GoToWebinar control panel, as well as tweeting Forum1 and from hashtag F1Webinar. So first question is, what are some simple ways that I can start examining site performance? And John, I would say maybe start with you on that question.
Yeah, well, you don't need any specialized tools like what we've used in that we presented here. Just about every browser has a set of developer tools, and I would suggest opening those tools up, going to the Network tab, and just doing a hard refresh. So usually that's like Command or Shift R, and seeing what happens there. And you can see the progression of your page as it downloads all the assets that make up that page. So you can count the number of different elements you're downloading. For Drupal sites, you can confirm that it's aggregating your JavaScript and CSS. And it gives you a lot of telltale signs about what might be slowing down your site. Drew, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that the free tools, webpagetest.org and Google PageSpeed, both of which you can find really just by Googling them, have let you run the test, but they also provide some helpful information on how to address some of the performance issues. And I think even Google PageSpeed kind of ranks it for you and tells you, mobile and desktop, what you should fix, like aggregating your CSS and JS, or doing a better job of compressing the images on your site, things like that. And it's a good place. Both of those are, I think, good places to start. You can share the links around with your team, and so everyone can kind of get an idea on what's happening.
One quick note, when you look at the webpagetest.org scores, Mercy Corps got a poor grade on the category of caching static assets. And when you look at the actual performance of the site, and this report, in which assets aren't being cached, they're actually assets provided by third-party tools, so like analytics scripts that we don't really have any control over because they're being included by this services platform. So yes, we're getting a poor grade on it, but we can't do anything about it. So there are areas that you can do the best you can on to optimize, but remember that these tools that we're using to measure performance, they're just tools.
Great, thanks, Drew and John. I have a couple of questions that are of similar nature from James and Danielle. They're interested in knowing how you handle having a lot of bold images on your site without it hampering performance. James noted that his lowest marks came from big images.
Well, I can jump in here at least first on this. So that is an area, that's one of the next areas of improvement for us. And images are they're a big issue. So if you use a lot of JPEGs, making them progressive JPEGs helps so that they kind of load like the old TV scan lines. There are a number of file compression tools that are out there. I really wish the Drupal image styles module had some better settings on that, and or to help, but they're Node.js scripts that can be, post-process images. But that's
we looked at this early on. Mercy Corps has a lot of very beautiful images across their site, taken by their staff and all the countries they work in. And the key would be to compress the images losslessly. And I took a look at what kind of benefit this could have afforded the Mercy Corps site, and we saw about 8% reduction in image size, which it certainly isn't something to discount, but we thought we could get some bigger improvements through making sure that page caching was working, through organizing these assets better on the page, and providing some more robust caching mechanisms.
One more, if I can throw one more thing in there. We're also utilizing the CDN module. As John said, browsers are limited to the number of simultaneous HTTP connections they can make. By moving your images, if you have a very image-intensive site, moving some of your images to a like Amazon, something like that, you can take advantage of parallel downloads. So because browsers can actually download from different domains at the same time. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it can open up more connections if it's downloading from different domains. So there are some good workarounds out there. My concern as a UX designer, of course, too, is image fidelity and versus compression. And I would love to say I've found the magic solution, but I haven't.
Great, thank you, John and Drew. Susan has a question for Drew. If you would please define how you define a conversion in this case.
Sure. So, conversion rate in generic is basically the number of visitors to the number of, the goal action. And we're defining conversion rate as number of visitors to the number of donations that are made on the site. And we break it out desktop and mobile. And that's, kind of going back to earlier in the presentation was, our mobile, the mobile experience, and we know that that's, where the, where things are going. So it's really important to keep track of both desktop and mobile conversion rates.
Great, thank you, Drew. Raven has a question for John. With regard to the expectation of performance for Drupal core, should we expect to see some performance degradation from an out-of-the-box Drupal install? Would benchmark testing capture this across any site based on that CMS?
Repeat the question. So is the question about how well Drupal performs out of the box?
Yeah, so she wants to know if there's any degradation of performance if you have an out-of-the-box install. And then would benchmark testing even capture that across any site based on that CMS? So maybe.
Well, Drupal out of the box, it's pretty light, and I forget if page cache and aggregation are on by default, but they're really simple to enable. And as long as you make sure those two items are on, Drupal out of the box is pretty light, because one thing that decreases the performance of a site is the number of modules that are in Drupal. Since it's a lot of it is based on a hook system, Drupal runs these polls for, does this hook exist, or does this module implement this specific, patterned or named function that it then executes. So, yeah, out of the box, Drupal performs pretty well as long as the page cache and aggregation are turned on. But out of the box, Drupal also really isn't particularly useful for an enterprise level site. So it's when we add these features over time that sort of accrues this technical debt, as you were, like the session variables we mentioned earlier that were causing problems with the page cache. So this aggregation of features and perhaps development practices that might cause problems over time are really a big detractor to performance in Drupal. So I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you, John. James has a question about WordPress. He notes that many of the premium WordPress themes look great, but they're a bit slow to load. And he wonders if you have an opinion about the WordPress caching plugin.
Admittedly, my WordPress experience is limited. More of a Drupal guy. Drew, I don't know if you might have experience with that.
No, I don't have experience with that part of plugin for WordPress.
So we'll get back to that. I still want to answer that question, but we do have a team of developers who do work with WordPress at Forum 1, so I'll ping them in our group chat and respond to that.
Thanks, John. So I have another question regarding sort of timing. How long will a project like this take to complete? Bearing in mind that you need to measure each specific improvement, how much time does each one of those, how much time do you need to evaluate the efficacy after each measure is completed? What would somebody expect for sort of overall timing and planning with a project of this nature?
So how long the project to just improve the performance in general would last?
Yeah, like the iterative work that you're doing at each level. So how long do you need to measure the efficacy of each improvement you make?
We started this about a month ago, and some of the time was spent developing the instrumentation to run these measures. But in terms of actual focus on improving performance, I would break that out. I think we were able to turn this around with juggling the actual measuring part and in just a matter of a couple of weeks, honestly.
Yeah, I would add in that if you're really into the statistics part of it and measuring it, it would depend on the amount of traffic that's coming to your site to reach statistical validity, I guess is how you would say it. We started actually, so we started this project last June, and I had a system administrator and a Drupal developer that I kind of lassoed into helping me make these changes, and it took, well, we'd make progress, and things we'd have to go back and switch over to different projects, et cetera, et cetera. So we've really benefited from having John be dedicated on pushing this forward. So yeah, the recap is, if you can, I mean, it's complicated. And it involves multiple people on the team, and yeah. So, and then again with the statistical significance, what's your site traffic look like, and how. I think by prioritizing has really helped us too. What's the best? Where do we? We kind of stood back and said, where do we think we're going to get the best, sort of best bang for the buck in terms of effort, and measuring the improvements in terms of their level of effort and prioritizing them.
Great, thank you, Drew and John. John, that sort of leads me to thinking that it might be helpful to talk about how Forum 1 took a step back and did the first initial evaluation. Maybe talk us through what your process was for identifying what needed to be fixed, and how we prioritize improvements, specifically seeking larger gains from lower hanging fruit, and how that evaluation was sort of documented and laid out for Mercy Corps.
The Mercy Corps initially approached us with an interest in this subject a couple months ago, and we started with just a general evaluation of the Mercy Corps site, and really not throwing any idea out. Some improvements to a site could just be, I mean, they can make a change, but in the end, they're probably just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Not to imply Mercy Corps is a Titanic, but their impact is limited to the sweeping change. So what we did was we went through, didn't throw out any idea. We identified what are the pros and cons of each idea was, and then we ranked them according to one, sort of like a subjective opinion on one, their level of effort to implement, and two, their potential impact on the site. So, for example, varnish would probably provide a huge benefit to the site. It's very significant, but implementing varnish, yeah, you just like install it and have it ready to go. But there's training involved with the Mercy Corps administration team, familiar with that area. So while it did offer potentially huge impacts, it got bumped down that list. Views caching ended up being one of the #1 items because it was just a matter of a configuration change in a few of the administrative pages of Drupal. So that rose to the top for that reason, even though the potential impact was more of a moderate one, but certainly not rearranging deck chairs. And is there any more?
Nope, that's great. I also have some feedback from for James on the WordPress question regarding WordPress caching plugins. So one of them is there are a lot of caching plugins nowadays. There's W3 Total Cache being one of the bigger ones. And many of the more popular themes on ThemeForest tend to include everything and the kitchen sink, which, depending on the theme quality, can have an impact on site performance. And then another comment I have here is caching plugins are useful if you have a large number of pages that are being viewed many times. For example, a ton of blog posts that are continuously viewed. Caching plugins save a snapshot of the page in HTML so a database call isn't required every time the page is viewed.
Heather, if I can just total kind of a non sequitur here, but someone earlier in the conversation asked about images, and I forgot to mention, and this is a WordPress plugin, and I've been impressed with TinyPNG. It also does JPEGs, and they have a WordPress plugin.
Great, thanks for adding that. So just coming in now, Daniel asks, what's causing the problem with the session variables?
So just simply using a variable, these are called global variables generally in PHP, and you have a couple of them. One is, if you're familiar with PHP code at all, everything starts with a $, and then an underscore, and then and generally something with an underscore means it's system level. Try to avoid using them if you can avoid it. Like, so you get a variable for cookies, you get a variable for your server environment, and you get one that's a $, underscore session, all in caps, and this signifies that you want data to be stored for this user between sessions. What does that mean? It means an entry is created in the sessions table in the Drupal database, and that data is then serialized and stored in that session table. And then the user is handed a session cookie, which they will then use for their subsequent requests. And this is how Drupal would track, who's logged in as a user and not. But because of that, users with sessions bypass the page caching mechanism in Drupal. So Drupal is a very intensive CMS when you're bypassing these caching mechanisms. So this is where a lot of bottlenecks might occur with performance in general when you have either a lot of logged in users or not using the page cache. So simply using this global variable generated a session, and since the user now had this session that they would continue to use until it either expired or they cleared their own cookies, they could no longer be served cache pages. And so that's a huge problem. And we worked to resolve that by using some alternative caching mechanisms or alternative mechanisms to store that data, like using cookies directly in the front end.
Great, thank you, John. So at this point, I don't have additional questions. I want to do another call for questions. If you've got questions, please submit them via the question feature on the control panel of your GoToWebinar, or you may send them to @forum1 via Twitter or hashtag F1webinar. We'll just wait one more minute to see if any other questions come in. John?
Yes.
While we're waiting for that, and Drew, actually both of you, can we just talk a little bit about our sort of next steps, maybe in a little more detail about what we're planning to sort of finish? We're not quite done with this project. So in general, like, what's our plan for moving forward? We've seen some great improvements, and what's next on the list of things to do?
So yeah, we identified that quite a number of items that were on the list. So deferring JavaScript is one. So this is taking JavaScript includes that are normally in the header of the site by default and moving them to the footer. There is the magic module in Drupal that provides this sort of functionality. And like I said, a web browser can only download so many things at a single time. So for most browsers, that's between 5 and 8, depending on which one. So if you have, a dozen different JavaScript files that are included, then your browser has to wait to download those before it can move on to the next one. And since a lot of the functionality that these JavaScript includes are driving, aren't really noticeable to the user, especially an anonymous user on a site, these can be delayed towards the end. Another tool, like we talked about Varnish earlier, this is what's called a reverse proxy cache. That just means that it sits in front of your software, in this case Drupal, and it will save any served page so that whenever a user submits a request to the server, instead of passing that request on to the CMS, it just serves that page if it has it. If it doesn't, it allows the user to continue on. And we want to examine more the mobile setup. So we've improved that somewhat in my web page test evaluations since this past weekend's deployments. We're still hitting about 15-second load times, but a lot of that did include those third-party analytics scripts that were being downloaded. Taking a look at the actual waterfall diagram of the progression of the request, I think the usable page rendering was done by about 7 seconds. I think we can still do better with this, and looking into options for that. And one of those very well will be compressing the images on mercycorps.org. I did a trial run of those when we, earlier in this project to see how feasible that was and how much of return we'd actually get on that. We used a tool, or I used a tool called, I think it was Opta or IMG OPT, or it might be OPT IMG. I forget what its name was at the moment, but it will go through and reportedly losslessly compress the images on a site. And those are our ideas for future work on this. And Drew, do you have anything to add to that?
Just sort of to add on to the images part. Yes, so better compression of the images. The images, our homepage comes in at about 1.3 megabytes if you're loading the desktop version, and the bulk of that are images, and that's another, as John said, that's an area where there's image API optimized. It's a Drupal module. We use the adaptive images module, and that's kind of its own special beast that allows you to, it basically checks your breakpoints and serves up the, a mobile or a tablet or whatever, breakpoint sized image you have. So it's getting all of those things to sort of work in concert together to reduce the image size. And Varnish is really promising. And the deferred JavaScript, so kind of maybe on a high level, is that by moving, as a page loads, it has to load, it loads sequentially in the JavaScripts that it encounters. And by moving these things, non-critical scripts to the bottom of the page, that's what John was talking about, deferring the JavaScript. And I think we have some work to do on our styles and our style sheets, where a lot of Drupal modules get included into the styles that are written into the page. And but yeah, those, I think John really kind of covered what we see as the big wins in terms of performance.
Great, thank you, Drew and John. I have another question from Daniel asking, for the themes, what are your thoughts about data URIs, or uniform resource identifier schemes? Rather than having to make a HTTP call, you can have the browser render the inline images.
I might defer to Drew on that one. I'm not familiar with that.
Wow. Yeah, that is an interesting question. I really thank you. I hadn't considered that. Don't really have an opinion, at least an informed opinion, other than that's an intriguing idea. Yeah.
Is the idea including the actual binary data for images in the markup? I'm just trying to.
Yeah. So I've seen examples of something like that where you're using SVGs and actually including the SVG in the tag. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I've never played with that myself. Yeah, that is intriguing. My only concern would be if you're, as you're downloading the HTML document, when you encounter a reference to an external image file versus an inline file full of binary data, or included directly in the markup, then you have to download that markup first before it can, say, continue on to the next set of assets. So since we have an opportunity to download items in a sort of a distributed manner, especially if we're using a CDN, my concern would be the bottlenecks of making sure that the primary document is downloaded first. That's just my gut reaction, though. I'd have to play around with it to develop a better opinion of it.
You had an example, like can you base 64 encode them?
Right, oh, you're right. That is an option. I've never played with that before. I'm not even sure what options Drupal provides for doing something like that. So I'd be interested in playing around with it. But that was my gut reaction. But I'd have to validate that.
Great. Thank you, John and Drew. Well, at this point, we don't have any more questions. So I just want to thank all of the attendees for joining us today. And I want to remind you that we are recording this webinar, and we'll provide a link to the archived recording and the slide deck. We'll send that to you via email the next couple of days. Thank you, John and Drew. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Heather.
All right. Bye, all.